connection itself.
All right. Okay. Well, I'm confident that as we speak here that other people will be joining, but within the constraints that at 1 o'clock you do have another engagement, I do want to go ahead and introduce you, and then I am confident other people join us. So I have a pleasure of introducing Rabbi James Bennett. He served as senior rabbi of Sher Emeth in St. Louis, Missouri since 2004. He was born in Boston, Massachusetts. Rabbi Bennett graduated from Indiana University in 1979 with an undergraduate degree in economics, Phi Beta Kappa, and with distinction, and was ordained in 1984 at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati, Ohio. Upon ordination, Rabbi Bennett served as assistant and associate rabbi of Congregation Sher Emeth from 1984 to 1993. He served as senior rabbi of Temple Beth El in Charlotte, North Carolina from 1993 to 2003, before returning to St. Louis to become senior rabbi of Congregation Sher Emeth in 2004. Rabbi Bennett is a senior fellow of the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem and serves as an adjunct professor of Jewish philosophy and theology at St. Louis University. He has served in numerous leadership roles in many organizations over the years, focusing on Jewish thought, education, social justice, youth and education, interfaith relations, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Rabbi Bennett is married and has 3 grown children. Rabbi Bennett is also Dr. Joanne Bennett's younger brother and was greatly impacted by her life. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Kathy, and I'm honored and grateful to be here. And thanks to all of you who've taken time out of what I know is a busy professional and personal schedule to join in. I was so honored when Kathy asked me if I would be willing to share in this gathering. And I'm excited to be with you all. And I hope that will not only be, you won't only be listening to me, but also that we can hopefully have some time for dialogue and discussion. I prepared a presentation that I'll share in a little bit by sharing my screen, but I want to start by just talking about some personal and my own journey and how I ended up here, other than just being one of Joanne's younger brothers. I'm one of 4. Joanne was the oldest, the only girl in our family. And myself, I'm number 2, and then I have 2 younger brothers. And I will say on behalf of all of us that we always looked up to her as our older sister, as the first one to get into trouble all the time in her life. But more importantly, we admired and respected her as an incredible teacher and mentor to us. And the fact that she became a physician following in my father's footsteps took some of the heat off of us. One of my younger brothers and I both decided to become rabbis. None of the 3 boys became doctors, but we were always so immensely proud of Joanne and grateful for her. And I want to talk this morning, or today, I guess it's not morning anymore. I want to talk today with all of you about the stated question, the Jewish perspective on end of life, through the lens of my own personal experience, our religious experience as Jews, the way the Jewish faith speaks about end of life. I'd like to share briefly a little bit of my professional work as a congregational rabbi in as much as it relates to end of life issues, and reflect on all of this through a very personal and real and genuine lens. And I wanted to formally say something that is already evident, I hope, in both Kathy's words and as well as mine, that I'm formally viewing today as a presentation that I'm going to dedicate in memory of my sister. Dr. Joanne Bennett was a remarkable human being, as I think those of you who interacted with her knew. And her life mattered tremendously. And as I was sharing with Kathy a few minutes ago, Joanne always told me that among the most beautiful and happiest places in her life was her time spent in Sioux Falls, and a number of you are the reason why. So I just want to say thank you to you, and I dedicate my words today in Joanne's memory. So let me begin. I'm going to speak a little bit, and then I'll share some text by sharing my screen. Death, this may sound funny, but death was always present in our home when we were children growing up. My father, Dr. Gerald Bennett of blessed memory, was a pathologist by training. Started his career in general practice, but became a pathologist and followed his career moving around the country many times to different positions as hospital pathologist and also as a professor of medicine. And he taught and exposed us as a family to his love of medicine and of the human body and even of life and death from the youngest ages. So because he was a pathologist, I don't know that this is true of all pathologists. He's the only one I really knew well. But because he was a pathologist, we were exposed to death all the time. It was part of our conversations. He never hid it from us. We had pictures on the wall. One of his groups of medical students gave him this beautiful framed giant picture that had been made to look like an oil picture of him performing an autopsy with the body cut open right there on the table and him surrounded by his students. It actually was a beautiful picture, but kind of graphic and weird. And it was right in our house, in the middle of the house. And we had a dead body on the wall in our house. That's what I'm trying to say. And I think that was symbolic of the way death was just normal in our house. We talked about it. We knew what Dad did. We knew that when he went in to do a postmortem, to perform an autopsy or to consult on a case, we knew that he was dealing with bodies of human beings that had died. And while it was a little odd, especially when we were young, and while we were a little squeamish, we also came to understand death as a normal and healthy part of the human life journey. And at the same time, I want to say, like most Americans, I think, of any cultural background, death in a weird way was kept at arm's reach when it came to our own family, particularly our relatives. I remember, for example, two of my grandparents died when I was a young child into my early teens. And not only was it barely talked about, but none of the kids were allowed to come to the funeral. We were kept at a distance kind of to protect us. So while death in an abstract way was very real and present, death in a personal and more immediate way was very distant, very over there, very out there, very far away. I grew up and I decided to become a rabbi, and for reasons that I don't want to take time to discuss now, but I found my way into the rabbinate and knew that I wanted to be a congregational rabbi to work with people in a community. And from the very beginning of my work as a rabbi, everything changed. 1 week into my very first pulpit back in 1984, I was still wet behind the ears from rabbinic school. I was called, the senior rabbi for whom I worked was on vacation. I came to town and he left, which I didn't take personal at the time. But I got called by a funeral director who said, Rabbi Bennett, and I had to pause for a moment before I said yes, because I wasn't even used to hearing myself referred to as rabbi. Those of you who are physicians or nurses or other professional titles probably can relate to that first time that you heard somebody use your title and weren't sure who they were talking to. So Rabbi, I turned around to see if there was a rabbi in the room, and then I answered. He said, we need you to officiate at a funeral. And not only had I never officiated at a funeral through all my training, I actually realized I had never even attended one. That's how distant death really was from me in my life at that time. But very quickly that changed by necessity. And soon I was not only working with families as their loved ones approached the end of life, visiting with families in the ICU in the hospital and coming in to pastor them, to help them as they made difficult decisions, standing with them as they began to grieve, helping them to make arrangements for their funerals and teaching them about Jewish mourning rituals. All of this became more and more de rigueur, it became just normal part of my life. I also began to be profoundly moved by the impact that families had on me as I watched and witnessed and shared with them making these incredibly difficult decisions at the bedside of their loved ones. That was in the mid-1980s. And I think in the 1980s, there was a very different awareness of end of life than there is today. Many of you probably have personal experience with that. I want to share one particular story that was profoundly impactful on me as a developing, evolving young rabbi. Sometime in those years, I don't remember the exact year, a congregant of ours, a gentleman in his late 70s, was hospitalized with very serious pulmonary complications. I don't remember exactly what his illness was, it doesn't matter, but he was in the ICU at the local Jewish hospital, which today is part of the BJC healthcare system here in St. Louis. His wife and he had been lifelong members of our congregation, which is a Reform congregation, the most liberal branch of Judaism. But they had a number of children. I think they had 4 or 5 children, and most of them had migrated their way on their own personal faith journeys into much more observant branches of Judaism. They were all Orthodox, practicing Orthodox Jews who took very seriously the teachings of Jewish law. Their rabbi, the children's rabbi, had come to the hospital to visit their father and mother and to be with them as was appropriate. He was counseling his congregants. And I was coming mostly to comfort the wife who was there with her husband in the ICU. The Orthodox rabbi had taught them about the teachings of Orthodox Jewish law regarding death and dying, which we'll talk a little bit more specifically about in a little bit, as he interpreted them according to the strictest interpretation. The wife and mother did not actually agree with much of what he was telling them. She took a different perspective, and therefore she was taking a different perspective than that of her children. She was torn in this moment between her own personal belief system, her relationship with her husband, what she knew and believed was what he wanted, and her children who wanted something very, very different. She was torn between her loyalty to her husband, to herself, or to her children, and to her faith. And we spent literally hours discussing this. At one moment that I've never forgotten, because this is the first time anybody ever said anything like this to me, and it was shocking and powerful at the same time. She said to me, "Rabbi, I just want to go into his room and put a pillow over his head and end this, but my children won't let me." Ultimately, because Jewish law, as I'll teach you in a minute, does not permit us to actively end a life, nor do most faith traditions and most laws. But she wanted to, and she knew this was what he wanted. He wanted it to be over. She wanted to find a way out of this dilemma. Ultimately, he ended up living on that respirator for over 6 weeks in the ICU, never regaining consciousness, and then eventually he simply died. It was then that I knew that I had to immerse myself in the literature and the teaching about Jewish law and ideas and Jewish thought, and develop my own personal perspective as well as a rabbi and as a human being about what Judaism says about the end of life. I knew that I had to resolve this in my own mind so that I could help other people. But my story doesn't end there, because really it was just beginning. I grew up, and I didn't tell you this in the earlier part of my story, but I grew up in a family where my father was quite direct about his attitudes towards death. As a pathologist, as a person, he really did not like most of what our society and the laws of our society and the medical profession had taught him over much of the course of his career, becoming a doctor in the 1950s and retiring in the 1980s. He was, for example, a lifelong supporter of and member of the Hemlock Society. He believed, I remember we debated a lot, and he believed firmly in the work that Dr. Kevorkian and so many others did to find ways to advocate what was called assisted suicide back in those days. And he was quite upfront about this. And I came to be very emotionally allied with him, but I confronted a great contradiction when I began to become a rabbi and discovered that the Jewish tradition, by and large, does not embrace most of this very liberal attitude towards end of life. My father had a debilitating stroke back in the early 1980s that left him largely aphasic and largely unable to engage in complicated conversation, but physically quite well until his death in his 70s. My mother, on the other hand, fought a lifelong journey with illness, particularly diabetes and a debilitating kidney disease. She had a kidney transplant in her 50s. She was on dialysis at the end of her life and confined to a nursing home. And all of us were torn between our belief that we should encourage our mother and my father's wife to fight against all odds, to make the most out of her life and do everything she could for herself and for us. And on the other hand, our compassion and our recognition that we knew she was reaching the end of her life. It was obvious, no matter what we or any doctors or medical professionals could do. And she began to tell us in the final weeks that she was tired and she was ready and she didn't want to do it anymore. We witnessed her declining all treatment. She said to us, "I don't want to go to dialysis anymore, I'm done." And she was quite coherent and articulate. And we called in witnesses from the nursing home and all the steps that were necessary in order to make sure that we could do this appropriately and legally, until a well-intentioned but extremely religious, not Jewish, an extremely religious and zealous nurse in the nursing home took it upon herself to decide that she knew better than my mother or my mother's family what was best for my mother. And she threatened to intervene and to bring the state in to intervene. And luckily, my father and my sister and my brothers and I were all unified, and we were quite angry at this person who, for wonderful reasons, I'm sure, because of her faith and her training and her beliefs as a medical professional, nonetheless thought she knew better than everybody else in our circle what was best for my mother. And luckily, my mother was always in charge, and she was in charge then. And she eventually just died. And we didn't get taken up before the Delaware Board of whatever we would have, which we were threatened by. And we were certain then and still to this day that we were right and that my mother's wishes were honored, that she was allowed to die a peaceful and gentle death. Over the ensuing years, my sister and I spent endless time talking about that and the bigger issues, discussing life and death, joking about going into business together where I would care for their souls and she would care for their bodies, and then I would bury them after they died. Struggling with ideas, sharing books and articles. I got to listen as she told me amazing stories in Sioux Falls and elsewhere, and she listened as I told her my stories as well. And I often pointed out to Joanne, as maybe some of you did as well, that her decision ultimately to go into palliative care medicine was not accidental. It was the result of everything I've just told you and more. Because little did we realize that ultimately she was telling her own story and preparing herself and all of us for what became her own personal final journey from life to death and then to whatever comes after death. As a son and as a brother and as a rabbi and as a Jew and as a human being, I really believe that all of our ideas and our thoughts and our choices regarding life and death reflect who we are in totality, and they can't be divorced from our own personal narrative and our stories and our experiences and our myths and our hopes and our dreams. And that's what I want to share with you a little bit today by just giving you a brief glimpse into what Judaism has to say about death and dying. So I'm going to share my screen, if I may. And if any of you want to interrupt me, raise your hand or put up that little hand raised symbol on the Zoom reaction so that I'll know you're trying to get my attention. So I'm going to share my screen just to take you so you can read along with me. Like those of many traditions and cultures, Jews have been reluctant to discuss issues of death and dying, because I think avoidance is easier than acknowledgement and acceptance. And our cultural and ethnic bonds are often even stronger than our religious beliefs. So I've alluded to the fact that there's a difference between Orthodox and conservative and Reform and other branches of Judaism and secular Jews. Many of you may already know the differences, but Orthodox Jews are those who adhere most literally to the laws of God as given to Moses and recorded in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible, and as interpreted by centuries of oral tradition through what's known as the rabbis, the rabbinic tradition. And Orthodox Jews believe that those laws are binding upon us, and we should do everything in our power to observe them as literally as possible. Conservative and Reform Jews are more centrist on the issues of religious obligation. We challenge the assertion that God literally gave the Torah to Moses and to the Jewish people. We believe that perhaps Moses was inspired, perhaps the Torah was written by human beings inspired by God, perhaps the Torah has a human origin entirely, perhaps the laws of Judaism have evolved as the record of a people's faith and relationship with God. We allow for many, many interpretations, and therefore the laws, which are so binding and strictly interpreted by Orthodox, for non-Orthodox Jews are very open to interpretation. And of course, there are many, the majority of Jews in America, who actually call themselves secular and don't affiliate with any of the movements of Judaism, but are kind of just Jewish. And for them, Jewish law is at most a interesting, quaint, and convenient source of information and tradition when they want it. And often they don't want it, and so they're not interested in what Jewish law says. That said, the last note on the page here is something one of my professors once taught us, is that when it comes to life and death, that it seems that most, if not all Jews, no matter what, die Orthodox, meaning that when it comes to life and death decisions, people at least want to know what the tradition says, even if they ultimately choose to ignore it or to reject it. So some basic Jewish premises about life and death that I want to point out. You probably are familiar with the fact that Judaism is a faith that affirms life as the paramount of our values, the most important of our values. It's written in the Mishnah, which is one of our sacred texts, that one may transgress almost any Jewish law to save a life. And whoever destroys a soul, it is considered as if they destroyed an entire world. And whoever saves a life, it is considered as if they saved an entire world. Therefore, we believe and we understand that, at least based on this teaching, life is very precious, and we aren't simply allowed to do something that would treat it disrespectfully or neglectfully or cavalierly. And since we're allowed to break almost any other law in Judaism to save life, the implication is saving life is the most important value. In addition, Judaism teaches that our bodies don't belong to us. Our bodies are loaned to us from God. And therefore, we are supposed to hold them in sacred trust and care for them attentively. If somebody gave you something precious to take care of, you don't have the right to bring harm to it and to destroy it. And all sorts of Jewish laws, not only about death and dying, but about life. For example, the reason why Jews, traditionally Orthodox Jews, do not believe in tattooing a body, because you don't have the right to put something on a body that belongs to God, not to you. And it's also the reason, for example, why Orthodox Jewish law rejects autopsy and organ transplantation in many cases, unless you're saving a human life. The argument in favor of organ transplantation and even autopsy is if you can demonstrate that it is saving a human life, then you can disregard the prohibition of doing something to a body that otherwise belongs to God. It's also the reason, as an aside, why Orthodox Judaism rejects cremation of a body after death, although many, many Jews have disregarded this prohibition, and many Jews, including many members of my own family, have opted for cremation. So we're supposed to, on the one hand, do everything reasonable to save human life, and on the other hand, we're also taught that we must imitate God by practicing compassion and mercy, since each of us is created in the image of God, which creates, I think, an obvious contradiction. If we're supposed to imitate God and be compassionate and merciful, but we're also supposed to do everything possible to save life, what if those two values come in conflict, right? If we're faced with a person for whom the compassionate and merciful thing might not be to prolong their life indefinitely, how do we resolve this? Judaism teaches also in the book of Ecclesiastes, the day of death is better than the day of one's birth, which seems also to be a contradiction. And in the interpretation of this, in a text known as the Exodus Rabbah, we read that the day on which a person dies is better than the day on which he was born, because no one knows on the day of his birth what his deeds will be, but at his death, his good deeds are published for all in the book of his life, metaphorically. And for this reason, the day of death is better than the day of one's birth. An effort by the rabbis, I think, to say, well, no, death isn't better than life. It's a fulfilled and complete death that is better than a completely new and unfulfilled life. Our tradition also teaches, this comes from the Talmud, one who is in a dying condition, in Hebrew we call that a goses, is regarded as a living person in all aspects. In other words, a person who is in the process of dying is nonetheless fully living. They're not only partly alive, they are fully alive. And for example, this has implications. If a person is dying and someone near his house is doing something that is keeping him from dying, like chopping wood, that is keeping the soul from departing, the tradition teaches that you are allowed to, or even perhaps commanded to, remove the wood so that whatever is happening naturally in his life as a living and dying person can happen naturally. There's a famous story from the Talmud that you might have encountered in your study, perhaps. It's a very famous story about the death of a famous rabbi whose name was Judah Hanasi, or Judah the Prince. This comes from the Talmud. And according to the story, this is a similar story to the wood chopper. Rabbi Judah was suffering from what was described as a severe and painful stomach disease, creating terrible abdominal pain and distress. His devoted students and colleagues decreed a public fast, which is often done to pray for somebody. And they offered prayers for heavenly mercy. As the story unfolds, his handmaiden climbed to the roof above the room where he was sleeping and began to pray. And her prayer is recorded as, "May the immortal beings in heaven desire this rabbi to join them, and the immortals desire Rabbi to remain with them. May it be the will of God that the mortals may overpower the immortals." In other words, her prayer began by praying that he would recover, right? So that the human beings who wanted him to live could have him, and that God, who wanted him to die, apparently, could not have him yet. She was trying to intervene in the death process. However, the story goes on, when she saw how often Rabbi Judah resorted to the privy, painfully taking off of his tefillin, his phylacteries, and putting them on again each time he had to go to the bathroom, because you're not allowed to wear religious garb into the bathroom, she changed her prayer. And this time she said, "May it now be the will of the Almighty that the immortals may overpower the mortals." Now she began to pray that he would die. Watching all of his students, the other rabbis, incessantly continuing to pray for mercy, she finally took up a clay jar, an earthenware jar, and from the roof of the house, she threw it down to the ground. When they heard this shattering sound of broken pottery, they stopped for a moment. They ceased their prayers. And in that moment, according to the story, when their prayers, which were the life support keeping him alive, were broken and stopped, in that moment, his soul left his body and he departed for his eternal rest. It's an incredible story. It's an incredible story. Sorry, let me go back here. It's an incredible story because it teaches us that embedded in the tradition almost 2,000 years ago already was a teaching that said, yes, we are supposed to treat a living person, a dying person, as if they're still alive, and we should pray for them and do everything possible and intervene as much as possible. And yet at the same time, here is a very, what perhaps the most famous and important rabbi of his day, whose beloved students were praying for him. His disciples they couldn't let him go. They didn't want to let him die. They would do anything, and they were willing to pray 24 hours a day nonstop, creating, as I said, life support, keeping him alive. And his nurse, who at first wants him to live, realizes just how miserable he is and how much he really needs to and wants to die. And she decides to intervene passively, but somewhat actively, in interrupting the life support. To me, and I'm not a medical professional as all of you are, it's akin to, that woman I told you about wanting to put a pillow over her husband's head, or perhaps more akin to accidentally stepping on the tube from the respirator so that the airflow is blocked, or unplugging the pump, or whatever other, increasing the morphine, or whatever other passive or active steps we might make. And here in an Orthodox Jewish tradition that says you cannot intervene, you cannot do anything to cause and hasten death, is a story of somebody who did just that. She intervened and allowed death to take place. So I want to pause for a moment. I've been talking for almost 30 minutes nonstop, and I wanted to just pause for a second before we go on and see if there's any comments or questions, anything that you didn't understand, or just anything anybody wants to say. No obligation, but if somebody would like to, feel free to unmute yourself and just speak up. Okay, well, don't be shy. I've either bored you to death and you're all asleep, or stunned you with information, but somebody wants to say something.
Rabbi Bennett, I'm Christy Gullickson. I knew your sister. I worked with her for many years, and I just have to say it was pure pleasure being with you today and hearing your story and hearing the Judaistic way of looking at life and death. And I just so appreciate being able to do this, having you with us today. Thank you very much.
Christine, thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm really grateful. As I said at the beginning, I'm just so touched by Joanne's life, but also by all of you. And I want to reinforce how important to her you all were. So thank you.
In the chat box, also from Dr. Peterson Henry, she said that was a powerful story. Really appreciate you and your teaching.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I see that chat now. I didn't have that open. Thanks. Before we go on, anybody else want to share something? Please don't be shy if anybody wants to. If not, let me go on a little bit. I want to kind of turn a corner and spend a few minutes talking about kind of more pragmatic issues about the Jewish path of death and dying and mourning and grieving. To give you some insight, I know there's not a large Jewish community in South Dakota, but there are a number, and I had the chance to meet a number of the people in the Sioux Falls Jewish community when I was there, and I know that there are people who will come into your health system from time to time, or more often, who come from a Jewish background or have Jewish values or traditions as part of who they are. So I want to just give you a little bit of insight into sort of how we view the process of dying, of approaching death, and then what Judaism has to say about what happens when we die and after we die, what we're supposed to do. And this is not a comprehensive class on mourning rituals, but it's just kind of an overview. So I'm going to share my screen once again. So Judaism teaches, as I think we've talked about already, that life is precious and we should do everything we can to live our lives fully. Judaism is a very this-worldly religion. We do not, for example, speak about getting to heaven as a reward. life is about this world. It's a very here and now focused religion. And yet, as I hope I've introduced, it's very pragmatic as we begin to approach death. And of course, Jewish law kind of struggles with the tension between intervention, medical intervention, and non-intervention. On the one hand, we're supposed to do as much as we possibly can to preserve life. Jews are encouraged by their faith, regardless of what branch of Judaism they come from, to seek medical advice, to follow medical advice, to live healthily, to do everything practical, to live as long and as well as we can. And yet we're also told that we are not allowed to, or we're not supposed to intervene once things begin to become obvious. So you're allowed to put a Jew, for example, on a respirator or on other life support. But as that story I told you at the very beginning pointed out, once somebody is on life support, you are not allowed to intervene and take that person off of life support. Although the story of Rabbi Judah and his maidservant suggests that perhaps you can, as long as you are not actively intervening, as long as you are somehow passively intervening. In other words, she couldn't have gone in and screamed at those rabbis to stop praying, perhaps, but she could throw a glass jar on the ground and create a distraction, which they could choose to, if they really were serious about their prayers, they could have prayed right through the distraction, right? And kept praying. So there's this tension between intervention and non-intervention. We're not required to go to extraordinary means to keep someone alive, but once we do begin extraordinary means, we're not permitted, according to Orthodox Jewish law, to stop it. At the same time, I mentioned earlier compassion, I want to mention and mercy, I want to mention respect for individuals, respect for human beings, and also I want to add silence. I've learned over my years of counseling and comforting and pastoring people through their end of life journey as a rabbi, that there's not enough silence in those moments. Rabbis, maybe like doctors, want to fill the silence. We want to say our thing. We want to tell you what we know. And often what people need most is space for silence, for meditation, for reflection, for listening, for hearing, for calm. And this is part of our responsibility in Judaism during the approach of death. Once a person has died, at the moment of death, Jewish law teaches us to recite these three Hebrew words, Baruch, Dayan, Ha'emet, which in Hebrew means blessed is the judge of truth, implying that when a person ultimately dies, no matter how liberal or observant we may be, according to Jewish tradition, this has been God's decision. God judged that this was the moment when death was supposed to happen. And there are countless stories. If I had unlimited time, I could tell you of teachings that reinforce this. After you say Baruch Dayan Emet, that's what a person is supposed to say when you learn of the death of a loved one. After you say that, there are all sorts of superstitious rituals and traditions. For example, opening the windows in the room where the person has just died, according to superstitious Jewish tradition, to allow the soul, which has left that physical body, to escape, because souls leave when we die. Our bodies become just dust and ashes again. Our physical bodies are no longer living beings when we die, when we breathe our last breath, or whatever the definition of death might be. And therefore the soul leaves, and we don't want it to get trapped in the room. So it's kind of silly superstition, but on the other hand, it's something beautiful. Open the window, let the soul escape, because the soul has a journey to make to return to the wellspring of souls, to be with God in heaven, however you visualize where souls go after we die. Many people also believe in the tradition of closing the eyes of the dead person, which I know is not unique to Judaism, but it is a very Jewish custom. To close the eyes is because the superstitious tradition believes that the soul could re-enter the body, not through the breath, because the person is no longer breathing, but through the eyes. The eyes are a window into the soul. And so closing the eyes allows that person to be, it's like putting the shades down, that the soul can't get back in. And then we begin preparing the body for burial. There's a ritual bathing process called tahara, which means purification, that is very beautiful and dignified. It involves cleaning the body delicately, and it's done by the community. Members of the community come together in a ritual burial society, a group of men to prepare male bodies for burial, a group of women to prepare female bodies for burial. And in current times, one of the great dilemmas facing the Jewish community, especially the Orthodox Jewish community, is with an increasing number of people identifying non-binary gender. How does the burial society approach this in a respectful way that is both true to Jewish tradition and Jewish law, and also reflect the mores and values of our society and the individuals? I want to point out that what I just described to you, this ritual bathing, is a very Orthodox practice. Most Reform and liberal Jews do not choose to have their loved ones' bodies prepared that way for burial, but when they do, they're usually very glad they did. It's a very beautiful thing to know that somebody lovingly prepared your loved one for burial, as opposed to, clinical kind of, preparation for burial by somebody who's not really viewing it spiritually. They're only viewing it physically. The body then, if they're prepared for burial this way, is dressed in what's called Tahritium in Hebrew, which are burial shrouds, a simple garment, kind of looks like a pajama suit made out of linen. And its purpose is to remind us that everybody, no matter how wealthy or poor, rich or and powerful or insignificant in terms of their societal class, everybody's the same at death. Everybody's dressed the same. Wealthier people aren't buried in fancier clothing, and poor people buried in simpler clothing. And everybody in Judaism is buried in a plain wooden casket. Now, sometimes these are very elaborate and ornate plain wooden caskets, but they have to be completely wooden. No metal is allowed, in order that the body may be returned to the earth as easily as possible. Nothing to be in the way of preventing the natural process of from dust to dust, to ashes. And we believe in Jewish tradition in burying as immediately as possible. Orthodox Jews often bury the same day or early the next day. In my congregation, often people bury on the second or third or fourth day after death, but it's very rare, except in extraordinary circumstances, to have a burial more than 3 days after death in the Jewish tradition. Until burial, there's a custom of watching the body, which is done by a person called a shomer, which literally means a guard, but it's somebody to sit with the body, so the body is not alone. And in Orthodox Jewish communities, they have a person whose job it is to go sit at the funeral home with the person, not in the same room, but right nearby, and to recite Psalms from the Bible, to accompany this person, to keep this body safe and not alone until they're placed back into the earth. There's a lot of other rituals that we could talk about, what Jewish cemeteries are like and how they're different or similar to other cemeteries. The essence of a Jewish burial is simplicity. A funeral will include some prayers and readings and psalms, but mostly is a eulogy, telling the story and eulogizing the dead. And I'm often touched when people who are not Jewish come up to me after a Jewish funeral and say, wow, that's so beautiful. You spoke so lovingly about this person. And then we recite a prayer called the Prayer of Committal, which prays that their soul will be with God forever. And we recite a beautiful prayer called the Mourner's Kaddish, which is a long, you've probably heard it in movies and things. It's a long prayer written in the Aramaic language that celebrates God and life and thanks God for life. Jews then sit Shiva for 7 days, which is a 7-day period of mourning, where they limit all activities, stay in their home, and the community takes care of them. Then they have, through the 30th day, a lesser period of mourning where they can begin to emerge, but they still limit their activity. They don't go to parties or out to entertainment and things of that sort. And then at the end of 30 days, they begin a tradition of waiting till the end of the 11th month, and then annually to celebrate or commemorate what's known as the Yortzeit, the annual anniversary of death. which for Jews is much more powerful a day than the day of birth. I mean, we celebrate birthdays in Judaism. Don't get me wrong. You're all welcome to send me a birthday present if you want. But in Judaism, we honor our loved ones by recalling their day of death as opposed to their day of birth, in relationship to that reading that we read earlier that says that the day of death is better than the day of life because you have something to celebrate. You know, a new baby is just pure potential, but a person who's lived a full life and has died, that's what we honor and celebrate. So I'm going to skip over practical considerations just for the sake of time. We can talk about those during questions. I want to share a couple of brief quotes and then conclude. A very famous 20th century rabbi named Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, in a beautiful book that I commend to all of you called Man is Not Alone, wrote, "The greatest problem is not how to continue, but how to exalt our existence. The cry of a life beyond the grave is presumptuous. If there is no cry for eternal life prior to our descending to the grave, eternity is not perpetual future, but perpetual presence. God has planted in us the seed of eternal life. The world to come is not only a hereafter, but is also a here now. This," Rabbi Heschel writes, "is the meaning of death, our ultimate self-dedication to the divine. Death, so understood, will not be distorted by the craving for immortality, for this act of giving away is reciprocity on man's part for God's gift of life. For the pious man, for a really religious person," he says, "dying ultimately is a privilege because we have fulfilled our purpose and now we are giving a gift to God." I want to skip ahead to one last quote. From a Rabbi Jonathan Kendall, who in a book called The Last Dance writes, "We are taught in Psalm 90 to number our days so that we might receive a heart of wisdom. Here," Rabbi Kendall says, "is the real wisdom. End-of-life issues are never simple. They are complex and unsettling, sometimes discomforting and contentious. In this age of managed care, we often find ourselves acting as advocates for our own loved ones, lest their treatment by the book fall short of what we believe they deserve. At some point, hope and reality collide, and our emphasis shifts from being champions of every imaginable medical course to becoming partners with the Holy One in devising a gentle and humane path leading to the shelter of God's wings. While this elemental drama unfolds, we may find ourselves buffeted by currents long submerged, but still powerful and diverting. Our task is to navigate these waters with a singleness of purpose, shaped and molded by our values." I hope today that I've sort of illustrated for you what Rabbi Kendall and Rabbi Heschel are both speaking about. Rabbi Heschel speaking about our life as a gift to God, and Rabbi Kendall reminding us that this tension between living and fighting for health and life as long as possible, which Judaism does teach, also collides with and is coupled with an obligation to work actively with God and with our faith to find a way to the end of the journey, and to not fight up until that final moment and then feel defeated as if somehow death is a failure of medicine, or a failure of the system, or a failure of our loved one, or our own failure. And I was very moved by my own sister's journey. Joanne fought mightily and really worked hard to maintain meaning and value right up to the end. But I, as Kathy also knows well, I had the privilege of hearing her say, "And now my time has come. It's time. And I want to give that gift to you," and she wanted to give it to herself, but also to God, of saying, "I'm ready." And I hope that those of you who do the work you do, while I know most, if all of you are not Jewish, I hope the Jewish values and our perspective on these ideas will bring you meaning and enrich your work and help you continue to live by the same values that I know Joanne lived by and the values by which she died. So I'll pause and ask if anybody wants to ask any question. I see one, Roger asked a question about how Orthodox practitioners resolve the paradox. Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'll answer briefly this way. Orthodox Jews, on the one hand, really ultra-Orthodox, serious adherents to the literalist tradition in Judaism, the most literalist Jews, try very hard to follow their understanding of the tradition. Luckily for them, there is a tradition that allows the interpretation of the rabbinic tradition. So there's an unbroken chain of tradition where the ancient texts are augmented by the more recent texts and the words of the rabbinic authorities in every day. So there is the possibility of evolution of law. I'll give you one example. For many, many years, the idea of organ transplantation of a person, of the organs of a living person or a dead person into a living body was not permitted because of a literal interpretation of the idea that our bodies don't belong to us, and therefore you cannot cut a body open before or after death and remove an organ. You're just not allowed to do that. But over time, the rabbinic authorities, even in the Orthodox community, recognized that there was an equally powerful commandment to save life. And they therefore found a way to weave these two traditions together and allow an organ transplantation to take place in order to save life. Similarly, I don't know many Orthodox rabbis who would permit somebody to stop life support, but I do think there's an increasing recognition that people want to find ways, even with the tradition's help, to cease interventions when they can be. For example, removing somebody from a respirator. If the medical professionals say there's a significant chance of the person regaining breathing on their own, the most Orthodox authorities might permit that respirator to be removed, but not if the doctors and nurses and attendings said, no, it's impossible, they're going to die within a short time when we remove the respirator. So there's gray area, but there's just much less gray area in Orthodoxy. I also see a question about music. Oh, you're touching a part of my soul by asking that question. Molly, thank you, Chaplain. I'm a musician myself. I have discovered more and more that hearing music and also playing music and being musical is incredibly therapeutic and also is an important part, along with silence. I should have included that on my list. Often we bring music to the bedside of patients in the hospital or in nursing facilities or elsewhere as part of their spiritual practice, because music is clearly a form of spiritual practice. One of the things my sister really, really gained power from that was so beautiful was there was a music therapist who, Kathy, I don't know if you were instrumental in helping to make that happen, but there was a music therapist who came and worked with Joanne and actually helped her write a song of her own, her song that was unbelievably beautiful, that told her story, that was about her journey. So yes, thank you, Chaplain, for asking that question. We have a few more minutes if anybody wants to ask or say anything else. I'm happy to answer more questions or just hear your voices if anybody dares to speak up. Any dilemmas you're facing?
Well, Luann here, and thank you so much, Rabbi, for spending the time. And I wish we had another hour because there is so much. And preparing for today, I've been reading Rabbi Leder's book, The Beauty of What Remains. And I'm so touched by what he wrote. So I'm glad to see you nodding your head because it confirms that I believe it's a really good book.
Rabbi Leder was he was a year behind me in seminary. I know him very well. He's out in Los Angeles, and so we don't see each other often, but he is a incredibly insightful rabbi, and his book is beautiful. I just recently read it myself and recommend it to everybody. It's one of the growing body of beautiful texts from all traditions that inform our work. And I think our generation now has this blessing of having so much wisdom from which to learn. So thanks, Doctor, for sharing that with everybody.
Well, and one thing I was impressed by is the grieving period, and you talked about Shiva for 7 days, and there's more to it. And I think for at least me and many of the people I interact with, the period of grieving doesn't exist. I mean, when my parents died, I was in busy parts of my life, and so died, had the funeral, back to work. And I so love the idea of taking the time and being comforted and taken care of by a community of people. So should I assume this is done most of the time, or is it?
Yes, let me answer your question in two ways. First of all, I don't like to brag on Judaism that often because we're just another system of thought and faith and belief. And I believe Judaism's good, but I'm very much committed to the fact that all religious cultures and traditions have value and meaning. And I'm not a triumphalist Jew in any way, shape, or form. But in this case, I actually very much brag on the wisdom of the Jewish tradition, the wisdom of 7 days of Shiva, or 30 days of slightly, a kind of gradual return, and then 11 months of an even more gradual return. The wisdom is born by psychology. Psychologists tell us that, it takes time to grieve, and there are different stages of grieving. To answer your specific question, all Orthodox Jews observe this tradition. 7 days of intensive mourning, 30 days of lesser mourning, and 11 months of even lesser mourning. In the non-Orthodox Jewish community, everybody makes their own decision, as we do with everything. So I have some families who observe 7 days of Shiva. Many of our families say, well, that seems like a lot. And it is a lot. I mean, it's almost oppressive to have people coming in your home for 7 days, bringing you your food, sitting. There are all sorts of traditions associated with it, sitting Shiva. So many non-Orthodox Jews will sit Shiva for a day or two or three. Sometimes they'll do it from the day of the funeral until the Sabbath that week. So depending on when the funeral happens, like I'm doing a funeral shortly. In fact, I have to go soon to do that funeral. This family is sitting Shiva this evening and tomorrow, and then Friday night is the Sabbath. So they are ending Shiva so that they can come to the synagogue. We're just opening up our synagogue to in-person prayer. So, but everybody makes their own decisions in the non-Orthodox world. But I think most Jews know enough about this tradition to find their own version of it in their own life that helps them on this journey. And as you said, we sometimes need somebody else to tell us to take the time to grieve. I can't tell you how many times in my career I've heard people say, yeah, we're going to do the funeral today because we all have to go back to work tomorrow. And that's ridiculous. Unless your very life and livelihood depend on not missing a day of work, it's ridiculous for people not to have space for grieving. So I see there's a question about food and drink. The food and drink is viewed as sustenance. So the same law that applies to you have to do everything possible. You cannot withhold food and drink. And once you are giving food and drink, you can't stop giving food and drink and that was the dilemma with my mother. Dialysis and food and nutrition were what was keeping her alive. And when she said, I don't want any more life support, she wasn't telling us to pull a plug on a respirator. She was telling us to stop her dialysis and to stop giving her outside nutrition. She didn't want any fluids or any food. She just said, she basically went on hunger strike. And the nurse that I mentioned wanted to force her. And Orthodox Judaism would support that, actually, that you should continue to give food because otherwise you're starving or depriving somebody of essential life. So yeah, that's that same complication of that tension between the two extremes. Well, I hate to end, that's kind of a weird place to end, but I'll just end by thanking all of you for your attentiveness, by showing up. Thank Dr. Eisnes for graciously hosting me, and Kathy, especially you, not only for inviting me, but for your love and friendship to Joanne. And I'll just end again by saying what we say in Judaism when we speak of somebody who has died. We pray, may their memory be a blessing. Zecher tzadika livracha. May the memory of this righteous person be a blessing. I think it's obvious Joanne's memory is a blessing, and you're all blessings as well. So thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Good luck to all of you in your incredibly important work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I hope we meet again, maybe in person someday.
That would be nice.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.